studying ideologically motivated hate crime. And we have two outstanding witnesses this afternoon, Dr. Christian Leprek, who is well known to this committee, and Dr. Barbara Perry. So maybe I'll just ask you for your 7 minutes in the order in which you appear on the order paper, and then we'll move to questions. So Dr. Leprek.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames les Vice-Présidentes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Deputy Chairs and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today to discuss this highly important topic, and I'm be delighted to respond to your questions in both official languages.
I've provided my text in English, so I will follow the text there. So violent extremism in Canada is a marginal phenomenon, and situations arising out of ideologically motivated violent extremism garner a lot of public attention, and that's followed by political commitments or opportunities, such as the hearings that we're having today, to move on certain policies. Detecting domestic IMV and disrupting it is costly. These costs are disproportionate to the benefit, and there are many other threats, such as cyber, foreign interference, or foreign espionage, that are far more consequential for Canada's security, prosperity, and democracy, but they're difficult to quantify publicly in the absence of human casualties. If done better and more systematically, rebalancing Canada's national security and policing posture with a greater emphasis on cyber, organized crime, money laundering, and protecting Canadians from foreign malign actors would have a far greater benefit for public safety and depriving IMV of resources and enablers than the current approach, whose track record seems neither particularly efficient nor particularly effective. So who is likely to sympathize with, provide material support for, or engage in violent extremism, and why, has become one of the most pressing security questions of our time. And that question is made more difficult by the very small numbers of those in this category on the one hand, and the vast majority of people in comparable circumstances who are very resilient to radicalization. I provide some numbers that I will skip over, but simply point out that as shown in testimony before this committee, terrorist attacks and incidents, however extremely tragic, are very rare compared to many other incidents of violence and violence related to ideology. Then I make the point that we need to distinguish between ideologically motivated violent extremism and ideologically motivated extremist violence. One concerns the narrative, the other concerns action. I then lay this out in two pyramids, the narrative pyramid and the action pyramid. These two pyramids are distinct from one another. In the action pyramid, we have terrorists at the apex, radicals, and then below them, activist sympathizers. You got a similar description from Tim Holweg of CSIS in terms of passive engagement, active engagement, and mobilizing to violence. But the relationship between thought and action isn't clear. It's not a conveyor belt, and it's not causal. It raises a host of questions. How do individuals end up in one of those three radical action categories? Are there three different kinds of people who end up in these different categories? What are the drivers of the transition between these categories? What motivates an individual to cross boundaries, passing from non-radical to radical or from radical to terrorist? What are the barriers to these transitions? Why do so few people become radicalized? And is there anything special about these few? Do the categories of action and the transitions between different categories depend on the particular cause being espoused? Or do all movements and issues exhibit commonalities in the structure of radicalization? From the perspective of intelligence and law enforcement, we might also ask, is it possible to tell which category of action an individual will move toward by examining an individual's attitudes? And more generally, can current attitudes predict the future political trajectory of a particular individual. And so it turns out that the relationship between narrative and action is indeterminate. Few in the narrative pyramid ever move to action, and action is not necessarily motivated by a belief in a narrative. I sketched 12 mechanisms, micro, meso, and macro, that we've identified. And it turns out that ideology is just one of those 12. And in quite a few cases, ideology is not present at all. People engage in violence for a host of reasons that have nothing to do with ideology. So it's neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for violence. And when ideology is present, more often than not, ideology becomes the justification and the rationale for the violence rather than the cause of the violence per se. And so for policy purposes, we need to treat these as the problem of narrative and the problem of action as distinct problems. And we see this as such. In Canada, the problem of mass radicalization, that is to say entire communities who are radicalized, is not really a problem. What we see is individuals who are radicalized. And so this is a question about those individuals who are sympathetic to violence. And I would say that in terms of those investigations, and I explain this in my brief, we don't have a particularly great track record in terms of the RCMP and success of the RCMP. But democracy is on a slippery slope. When we merely hold political beliefs that, however objectionable they may be, those end up being equated with criminal behavior. With the exception of a few offenses such as incitement and hate speech that cross into the criminal realm, the hallmark of democracy is to police criminal action and not opinions. And so, generally speaking, radicalization per se, so a shift in beliefs, feelings, and actions towards increased support for one side or the other, is not a problem. And the challenge for democracy, the test for democracy always comes at the margins. And so I would conclude by saying that overplaying and politicizing the threat of IMVB by going after a needle in a haystack, a better approach would be for the government to improve how Canada's posture to detect, disrupt, contain, and deter against the full spectrum of national security threats in the first place. To that effect, we can focus on federal police reform to make the federal police more functional, a foreign intelligence or a human intelligence service, and a dedicated criminal intelligence service. And I would say there are many far greater threat vectors to public safety that Canadian communities confront day in, day out, from non-conventional threats by state and non-state actors, such as cyber, conventional threats, organized crime, money laundering, and the like, on which a government concerned about national security could take concerted action that would have far more direct and immediate impacts on public safety than IMV.
Thank you, Dr. Lieberg. Dr. Perry.
Yes, absolutely. My turn. Thank you very much for the invitation to appear. I very much look forward to sharing my thoughts and engaging in some conversation. I did share with you two graphics to sort of illustrate my comments today. And the first one is sort of a typology that we've been building around the diversity of the far right movement, which is really my focus, is looking at right-wing extremism specifically. So I want to sketch out some of the contours in a very short period of time, some of the contours associated with the far right that we identified in the study that we published in 2015, which was funded by Public Safety, but also coming out of the current study that we're working on, also funded by Public Safety, which is an update of that first one. And I think this first one, the categories of the far right in Canada, is quite important in terms of reminding us of the diversity of the movement when we think about the far right. Even in 2015, when we were looking at the movement, the focus was really on those very traditional kinds of groups that you see at the top: skinheads, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, what have you. Since then, there's been sort of a diffusion of the movement into different directions, not a splintering so much as a coalescing into much more discrete categories, so that there's an identifiable strand that is specifically anti-Muslim, that is specifically anti-immigrant, that is specifically misogynistic, for example. So in addition to that, we have the accelerationists, and each of these I can unpack a little bit for you in the Q&A if you like. But the intent of this graphic was just to highlight the diversity that we're seeing within the movement. The second graphic that I shared with you is the distribution as we saw in 2015. And you see the concentrations there in Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta, in particular, to some extent, BC, for a total of a conservative estimate of just over 100 active groups associated with some arm of far-right extremist ideologies. And in the current study, we're identifying over the past 4 years, 5 years, an incredible growth in those numbers to at least 300 now. And that is, again, across the country. We're seeing more activity down east, for example. But other than that, the concentrations have stayed fairly similar. That is, with higher concentrations, again, in Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta. Some of the other trends that we're identifying in the current study, just to share a few with you, I referred to the growth in numbers that we're seeing. And I should say growth in numbers of groups and growth in numbers of individuals drawn to various elements of far-right extremist ideologies. And so we're seeing, just as there's a fusion of the movement itself in terms of the number of focal areas, we're also seeing a diffusion or an atomization almost with respect to the movement itself. That is, more individuals being drawn to small elements, sort of cherry picking from the narratives of an array of different groups and ideologies to suit their own needs, whatever they may be. So we are seeing a lot more of those floaters, as we're starting to call them. But we also are seeing more groups, that is both new chapters of groups that were existing in 2014, 2015, as well as new groups that have emerged on the scene, most notably, the Proud Boys and Soldiers of Odin. We're also seeing a shift in the demographics associated with the group. So I think we, just as we tend to think of the far right as, the skinheads and the neo-Nazis, I think we tend to think of it as a youth movement. That is certainly still the case. There are an awful lot of youth, say age 16, 17 to 24, maybe early 30s involved in the movement. But we are seeing many more middle-aged and older folks coming to the movement as well. And accompanying that is a shift in other kinds of demographics in terms of education and income or profession in particular. So more middle income earners or above. So, I mean, we look at January 6th events in the US, for example, as sort of an inflated illustration of what we're seeing here, where, a fairly large proportion of those people were professionals, accountants and doctors and lawyers. And we're seeing some of that here as well. So that also implies then that many have a higher level of education as well, university degrees, advanced degrees in some cases. And I think that's especially the case within that element that refers to themselves as the alt-right. These are sort of the ideologues, if you will, of the movement, as opposed to the shock troops, which are those more traditional neo-Nazis or skinheads on the streets. One of the other trends that we're seeing is increasing coalition building or alliances. And early on in this phase of the study, so 2015, 16, 17, even 2018, we were seeing much more coalition building across groups. So strategizing across groups within the movement, planning and co-developing protests and rallies and concerts and a whole array of other activities. So we've seen a lot of that, but we're also now seeing, in the context of COVID, and especially in terms of lockdown and anti-mask and anti-vax activities, we're seeing efforts to leverage or exploit those very mainstream grievances and fold them into far-right narratives as well. So as a way of expanding their audience and grabbing people and sort of leading them down the garden path, if you will. The the last trend that I want to highlight is probably one of the most dangerous, and that is that we're seeing an increased fascination with guns rights and with being fully armed within the group. So even the Proud Boys, you know, one of their mantras is "We love our guns." And, you know, we see that in a number of other groups. We see images of them online with stockpiles of weapons and engaging in paramilitary training. So we've got that is they're heavily armed. We're also seeing, and this is another project we're on right now with DND, is looking at the contours of the far right within the context of the CAF, because we've had a number of high profile cases of late. And again, looking at the events of January 6th in the US, evidence of links between members of the CAF, current or former, and the far right movement. So we've got the arms, we've got the training, and the third dangerous, you know, sort of potentially lethal element of that are the xenophobic ideologies that often inform these groups. And I think that that is one of the trends that we really need to keep our eyes on. So I will leave it at that and flesh out anything that is of interest as we move forward. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. And we turn first to the first 6-minute round. Ms. Stubbs, Ms. Guerra, Ms. LaRouche, and Mr. Harris.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you to both of our witnesses for being here today and for offering your expertise and your time to us. Dr. Liprecht, you commented, I thought quite compellingly, about the difference between words and action, and sort of, I guess, the different sort of scales and kinds of people who might be identified when talking about these complex issues. I wonder if you might comment and expand on the differences between terrorists, radicals, and activists.
Yeah, and I think this is very, it's a very good question also in light of what my very talented colleague, Dr. Perry, just presented. That if we think of this as a pyramid, at the top you have people who are engaged in illegal action and violent action. And those are the people that we commonly have come to refer to as terrorists. Below that, we have people that we refer to as radicals that are engaged in possibly various forms, one or more forms of illegal action, whether it's illegal protest or perhaps firearms violations or so forth. But they're not violent per se against third parties or the public. And below that, you have activists. So those are people who, for instance, might possibly sympathize with radicals or with terrorists, but they themselves aren't engaging in forms of illegal action or illegal speech, incitement, hate, and the like. And so I think we often conflate these in public discourse. And I think it's important for intelligence, for enforcement purposes, for policy purposes, to treat these as three sort of distinct problems. One might be a problem of counter-radicalization, dissuading people. One might be a problem of making sure we have the right incentives in place so that people who might be engaged in illegal action don't engage in violent action. And for those who are predisposed or engaging in violent action, to make sure we have the criminal intelligence capabilities to detect and disrupt those before they can do harm.
Thank you. So and added to that, your points about the predictors of people taking action, I think in your research you suggest that religion, political opinion, and country of origin are all bad predictors, or not necessarily predictors that will necessarily result in action. So I just wonder do you have any comments on what purpose CSIS's categories of the motivation serve?
Yeah, I think it's important there's a temptation, I think, in the public discourse to reduce this to monocausal explanations. And clearly religion can't be one of them, because there's so many people who are religious and virtually none of them become violent. And many of the people who become violent, for instance, are not religious or don't adhere to any, say, ideology of any particular form. And so understanding that the predictors are multifaceted and combine in different ways in different cases is critically important. But I think this is sort of where some of the structural work that Dr. Perry is doing can help us, because it can help us identify some people who may be at higher risk, but then ensuring that, for instance, when we're talking about youth, and as we all know, youth, any of us who have children of our own or are familiar with youth know that youth do things that we would prefer them not to do, that we get them the right intervention and the right help, rather than necessarily and immediately criminalizing viewpoints that in and of themselves we find objectionable, but that aren't necessarily criminal.
And so to your point about protecting public safety through, I think, preventing and creating consequences for criminal activity, do you have any comments to expand on in terms of reforms or changes or concrete solutions for federal policing or other intelligence services?
A little more than a minute.
I would say that the much vaunted risk reduction measures that CSIS was granted, commonly known as disruption, that the ones that do not require warrants have proven quite effective and successful at reducing risk. I would also say that we could be much better. We have a federal police force that spends 85% of its time and resources doing provincial contract policing, which detracts from its federal mandate. And I cite at least one case, the Victoria Parliament plot, that was extremely unsuccessful given the resources that were invested into this case, where the RCMP was chastised by the judge for its entrapment practices. And so I think we need to be better postured in terms of federal policing. We need to have a separate criminal intelligence service and likely move that out of the RCMP and make that a separate standalone entity. And we need to have a better sense of the foreign influences here that may be illegal or criminal under Canadian law. And to that effect, we need a foreign human intelligence service, because CSIS, for reasons that go beyond our time here, cannot currently engage in that mandate effectively.
And we are beyond our time. Thank you, Madame Stubbs. Madame Cara, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses for being here, but more importantly for all the work that you do. Dr. Perry, I want to start off with you, and I want to talk about online hate. I know you've teamed up with Facebook Canada to address instances of online hate. It is a topic that I know in committee we've certainly discussed here. You've declared that online platforms have been a gift to alt-right groups known for spreading conspiracy theories, via video clips. Could you maybe expand a little bit on your findings and efforts in this area, and how do we address promoting hatred on mainstream channels as well as on those underground networks such as Parler and Gab? Thanks.
All very good questions, and not easy questions by any stretch. Yeah, absolutely. One of the most disturbing things we found in this round of work, we're working with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, who's doing much of our online analysis. And we have found in 2 successive years that Canadian posters are amongst the most active within the far right ecosystem, if you will. And so I think just quantitatively, that's problematic. We tend to think that we are immune to that kind of those kinds of narratives, but there you are. And in particular, in the first round, so that would have been the 2019 report that we did with ISD. We actually found that they were in fact second and third in two of the most extreme platforms Fascist Ford and Iron March. So these are the ones that are most likely to promote violence and mass violence in particular. So again, sort of quantitatively, that is the problem, but qualitatively as well. I mean, the breadth of the speech, the viciousness of the speech as it's directed towards particular individuals or towards particular communities. So whether it's directed, emails or posts that are, directed towards an individual, or those that vilify particular groups, it's just rampant online, obviously. And I think we have to consider the impacts of this for a community sense, a sense of community, a sense of belonging, and a sense of security as well. And it is something that absolutely silences communities, that makes them less willing to engage online, which has become, especially now under COVID, the way that we communicate. So how do we confront it? How do we regulate it? Such a challenge, as we've been exploring over the last 5 or 6 years globally, trying to constrain those sorts of the most heinous speeches. And when I'm talking about hate speech here, I'm talking about dangerous speech, that which promotes violence, that which promotes, explicitly promotes vilification and hatred directed towards particular groups. So what was identified in Warman v. Cuba as the hallmarks of hate, those sorts of elements of speech. I think we need to put certainly much more pressure on social media giants to enforce their community standards. Most of them are at least as strong as our own federal definitions. So we need to encourage the actual use of those. I hear so many the research, but also from people that I work with, who are identifying speech that seems to cross those boundaries, which there's no response to the complaint. So I think we need to hold their feet to the fire there. In terms of the alternative platforms, that's where the real challenge lies, because they're more difficult to access in the dark spaces for researchers, for police, for journalists, for anyone who wants to know what's happening in the darkest corners. But there are challenges there, because they're set up exactly to avoid any sort of community standards. So I think that most of us are at a loss as to how we respond to those. Again, perhaps we put pressure on the domains to not host them, as happened with Parler after, I think it was after the January 6th events. So I think that is the new challenge that presents itself.
Thank you. Thank you for that. You also noted, in your remarks that IMBE are usually directed in towards, already stigmatized and marginalized groups. As such, you said it is a mechanism of power. Can you maybe expand a little bit on which groups are targeted and how?
Yeah, and I should add to that, sort of maybe that's one of the another trend I should start talking about, is that, and again, in response to the online piece, is that we're seeing a real dramatic upsurge in anti-statist narratives online, and particularly anti-Trudeau narratives specifically. So it's not just those marginalized communities, perhaps. In this case, it's the champions of those marginalized communities who also become targets. So currently, we're seeing, we continue to see anti-immigrant sentiment leading the way, along with anti-Muslim sentiment. In some regions of the country, anti-Indigenous narratives are particularly popular, and we seem to be seeing a bit of a resurgence of anti-queer and anti-trans narratives among some of these groups as well. And it's interesting because it will shift over time in terms of, immigration patterns perhaps, or in terms of, the assertion of rights by particular communities, that sort of thing. But these seem to be the sort of key targets in recent days. And I think in the context of COVID, obviously, we need to also, raise the issue of anti-Asian narratives and violence. And I should add, finally, that anti-Semitism is always sort of there. It's always almost just barely below, barely above the surface, is almost a foundation for so many other forms of hatred. Often, those Jewish conspiracy theories are brought to bear to explain the evil ways of others, that Jews are, it's Jews that are responsible for, drugs in Black community, or for...
Unfortunately, Ms. Kerr's time is up. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you.
Thank you.
Madame Larouche, bienvenue au comité. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Welcome to the committee. 6 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to begin by thanking our two witnesses here today for discussing this important issue with us, Mr. Leprecht and Ms. Perry. Your opening remarks were highly instructive. I'd like to direct my first question at Ms. Perry. In your opening remarks, if I understood, you explained, and I'd like you to elaborate on this, the link between the far right and the anti-women movement, which you raised. And you closed by saying that radicalisation exists in the Canadian Armed Forces. I know that in November 2020, with the University of New Brunswick, it received $750 million for David Huffman, a researcher, and you, Ms. Perry, to undertake a 3-year study on hateful extremist ideologies within the Canadian Armed Forces. Now, based on the announcement, you spoke with Jonathan Vance, who was the former Chief of Defence Staff and who called on your advice at that time. So first, could you explain why the former Chief of Defence Staff called on you for your expertise? But I'd especially like to know what advice or recommendations you gave the former Chief of Defence Staff. And as your research indicates, sexism and misogyny are current characteristics in far-right groups. So how did you advise the Chief of Defence Staff as far as those issues were concerned within the Canadian Armed Forces?
I just point out that I doubt you received $750 million. I dare say that you received $750,000. And if you could, if possible,
I did indeed say 750,000. That was the interpreter who made a mistake.
Interpreter, yes. Anyway, and if you could bring it back to the actual study, that'd be good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just respond briefly to the first one. That is the question of misogyny in the movement, and there's no doubt that misogyny from the get-go is embedded in the far-right movement. I mean, it is grounded in racism, yes, but and anti-Semitism, but also in patriarchy. I mean, one of the mantras is the 14 words, which is well known. I think we must ensure the existence of the white race and a future for our children. So if we're going to ensure that, we have to control our women and our women's sexuality in particular. So that expands into other elements of the movement as well. And so we do see that continuing within the movement. So there's some overlap, and I should say in all of these areas, there's some overlap between, sort of what we think of as the incel movement and the far right, but not all incel activists are necessarily far right. With respect to the CAF work, it's very early days for us. We're still waiting for a research ethics approval at the university level. We do have a postdoc working independently on a targeted engagement grant with DND as well, looking specifically at policy interventions. And so I'll talk about maybe areas rather than specifics because we are seeing issues around people coming into the movement, going into people who are already in the movement and who enlist in the CAF, often in reserves, to get the kinds of training that they think they need and can bring back to the movement. So we're seeing problems already as people enlist. We're seeing problems with people being recruited while they're in service. And then we see problems with veterans, people who have left the military and are looking for a familiar place to belong. And so they're being lured into the movement very often. So we're looking at strategies at all three of those areas in terms of, screening tools at the outset, in terms of ways to monitor and identify, radicalization in service. But also because, there's sort of this gap between Veterans Affairs and CAF once people have left in terms of the kinds of supports they get in this area specifically. So that's another area that we really need to build out, I think. As you know, the DND and all branches have identified or created new orders around hateful conduct and engagement in identifiable groups, not identified, but identifiable groups with, sort of hateful conduct at their core. And so, part of our task will be helping to operationalize that or identify ways that those orders can be operationalized as well. Thank you for those questions.
Madame Perry, si j'entends bien.
Ms. Perry, if I've understood correctly, there is a link between that radicalization and toxic masculinity and the workplace culture where men dominate that we are heavily condemning in the Canadian Forces. That's what I'm hearing from your remarks in the studies that you're undertaking.
Yeah, that is certainly something that has been, something that we've seen with the far right generally. And so you put together that hypermasculinity associated with the far right with the hypermasculinity that is associated with the military culture as well, and it's almost a layering on there. And the forms of masculinity within the military that have enabled this culture of sexual oppression, again, I think underscores or exacerbates the toxic forms of masculinity which you're speaking there. So it's sort of doubly damaging and dangerous.
Okay, thank you, Madame Laroche. Mr. Harris, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank Dr. Perry and Dr. Lebrecht for their analysis and presentation. Let me start first of all with Dr. Lebrecht. Thank you for your very concise and incisive analysis as usual. And I think you've told us that the resources of society to protect the public would be better spent on some more conventional things than the individuals here, the dozen different causes for individuals to act up in a radicalized way. So that's helpful. But can I ask you something about the military, even though you didn't talk about it, because you're a professor at the Royal Military College, and I want to ask Dr. Perry some questions, but can you tell us what you have to say about the fact that there have been individuals identified in some events, including the Rideau Hall event involving military types? And Dr. Perry just mentioned that as a problem at the recruiting level. Sometimes people go into the military for that reason. But I heard recent comments from military leadership saying that the problem is more pervasive than they thought it was. What's your perspective on that from the point of view of teaching at RMC and also what the military ought to be doing about it?
So that's a lovely question, Mr. Harris. So no, because of course the Canadian Armed Forces are an institution that is tasked with defending our way of life. And so there's conduct that is unacceptable in the Canadian Armed Forces that may be acceptable in civil society. It may still be objectionable, but acceptable. And so I think that's the first point about the armed forces. The second is that inherently we know there's a selection effect in the Canadian Armed Forces, and that selection effect also has some ideological, it has regional dimensions, and the like. But I think it is not appropriate to construe and paint with a broad brush the Canadian Armed Forces, an institution that has shown itself fully committed to defending our way of life and associating the institution as a whole with somehow being sympathetic to any form of right-wing ideology. Yes, the institution has a challenge with certain aspects of institutional culture, but I personally object to relating that to right-wing idiosyncrasies and ideology. There are many issues that play into the institutional culture in the Canadian Armed Forces. I would also remind the audience that the individuals in the Canadian Armed Forces we're talking about are, to the best of my knowledge, all reservists. And they're reservists of various types that have spent different amounts of time in the Canadian Armed Forces. Some have been out and then sort of returned to the Armed Forces. And that the Armed Forces have also, by and large, done a reasonably good job at identifying these individuals or acting upon them expeditiously when these matters have come to their to their attention. And so there's certainly an issue where more needs to be done proactively. I know Australia and the United States have very much stepped up their efforts to identify these individuals precisely for the reasons that Dr. Perry laid out. Their propensity of some of them to join precisely to get the sort of training that we would never want someone with those sorts of points, with those sort of perspectives on life to have. But I think we've proven ourselves reasonably resilient, and that the organization has proven itself resilient against individuals who join for anti-democratic reasons. And so I would separate the issue of institutional culture from ideology.
Thank you, Dr. Lebrecht. Dr. Perry, you mentioned the notion of toxic masculinity and toxic. This is a cultural thing, obviously, as well. You find in institutions. Justice Bastarash told us it existed in the RCMP with misogyny, homophobia, and other aspects of toxic masculinity that he identified, and it was a cultural change is very difficult. Can you say so far whether you're going to have the kind of access that you think you will need to be able to do a proper job of investigating this question within the military?
We certainly have the support of senior leadership. The question will be, can we garner the participation of people across the service now? So we're doing, starting with a series of interviews with people at different levels, hopefully at the majority of bases across the country. And so as well as social workers and padres, those sorts of folks, then we'll do a survey. I think the survey will be the interesting one. I suspect we won't get as strong an uptake on that as we would like, which is the nature of survey research anyway. But I think that we're hopeful. We're optimistic with the interview phase in particular.
Thanks. Time for one last question, I think. Dr. Perry, you give an interesting chart of the distribution of the far right in Canada. I see there's no groups in Newfoundland and Labrador. That's a piece of good news for me. Tell us briefly, what is the manosphere, which you've identified as one of the categories of the far right?
That's that misogynistic element. So that which intersects often with the incel movement. So the parts of the movement that are particularly, we talk about toxic masculinity. This is the worst of the worst in the movement. That really their focus is on constraining women, constraining women's rights, and are most likely to engage in not just physical violence but sexual violence against women. Often women within their own arena, within the movement itself. And within specific groups.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Harris. Colleagues, our next round is a 25-minute round. We have 15 minutes or less than 15 minutes. So I'm going to take chair's prerogative and cut it back to 3, 3, 1.5, 1.5, 1.5, and 3 and 3. So, and the Liberals need to identify to me who their second questioner might be. So we start a 3-minute round with Mr. Kirk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the witnesses appearing before committee, and certainly very, very interesting, both what you presented and I've had a chance to look at some of your work. So to Dr. Lauprecht, and I apologize if I'm not saying that correctly. Your research suggests that online bravado appears to be a bad predictor of whether or not somebody will be a violent extremist. I don't think you say no link, just it's not a good metric to use to predict violence. And I ask this question in the context of being an elected official and having a online presence. I certainly have been subject to and seen a lot of very extreme content, some of which directed at me and just seeing other. But I'm wondering if you could expand on that and to talk about if that's an accurate summary of what your research has concluded.
So if you look at the amount of research that Dr. Perry has collected, if there was a connection, let alone a strong connection between bravado and violence, we would expect to see a lot more violence in Canada than we do. And so what it suggests is that we need a much more nuanced approach to the issue. And so I think there's 4 different levels at which we can engage in this. One is a matter of sort of the criminal investigation side for people who engage in this type of of conduct. But the other three conversations we need to have much more aggressively is, what are the economic and psychological barriers that as a society we have put in place to prevent people who engage in bravado and so forth from moving to action? What can we do with certain elements of the community where there is actually small groups and pockets that we can identify to tell counter narratives, to tell them a better story? And I think that's an opportunity in particular with youth that we know are susceptible to influence. And we also need to turn this around and ask ourselves, if there are so relatively few ones, but there's this huge number of zeros, what are we actually doing right as a society to make our society resilient from people buying in to this proliferation of hate online to begin with? And I think this is something where, compared to, for instance, some of our partner countries, Canada has done very well. And so focusing also here on, I think, the proactive measures that we as a society have in place.
30 seconds. You're on mute, Damien.
My apologies, Mr. Chair. I've been concerned about some of the politicization around this issue that seems to pen some of the ways we describe it into more of a political issue than how law enforcement could actually address this. So I'm wondering if you have any comments on that. I know the time is brief.
Very brief, please.
I'll provide a very brief reply that while there is a proliferation of groups, much of what's generated online, and Dr. Perry can maybe comment in the Canadian context, in the US, many of the vast majority of postings are generated by a tiny group of individuals. And so this is not a random distribution problem across society. It is highly concentrated among a few people who are extremely aggressive and proactive in the space, and a large number of followers that are hangers on.
Thank you. Ms. Damoff, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. You know, from quoting from the CSIS report, since 2014, 21 people have been killed and 40 others have been wounded on Canadian soil because of extremist ideological views. So obviously CSIS has a problem with what's happening. Dr. Perry, last month you said the far right has become more adept at integrating populist grievances into their own narratives and exploiting them to enhance membership. I recently read White Fragility, and in there there's a quote from the godson of David Duke where he talks about how we need to change the language that we use. We need to shut down immigration. We need to fight affirmative action. We need to end globalism. And you can win those positions as long as you don't get outed as a white nationalist. You had mentioned earlier about the anti-Trudeau sentiment. We're hearing talk of tyranny, corruption. I often, the people who use these terminologies call themselves patriots. I'm just wondering if you can maybe talk about your concerns around this a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that we have to put it in a broader context too. You know, I think that the events of January 6th are a reminder of the risk of allowing that kind of anti-statism to go unchecked. I mean, granted, there you had a political leader who was also sort of calling for or sort of a threat to democracy, if you will. But I think in the Canadian context, that sentiment, anti-Trudeau sentiment that we're seeing from the right, is also, I think, contributing or sort of being woven into similar grievances coming from the mainstream as well. And so it's this process of gradual absorption of those mainstream issues into the far right, reinterpreting them, sending them back. We saw that earlier with the Yellow Vest movement, which began as a really legitimate and important set of concerns around threats to the oil industry in particular. That same process is at work here in the context of shutdowns.
But when you talk about anti-Trudeau sentiment, we're not talking about differences on policy here. We're talking about people who actually believe the Prime Minister should be arrested and put in jail, right?
Yeah. Well, because there's a whole litany of crimes for which he's thought to be guilty. It's not just the lockdowns or mishandling of COVID. It's also, he's responsible for unbridled immigration and, dangerous refugees and all that sort of thing. So almost borrowing, Trumpisms from the
but the
US.
terminology that the white supremacists in the US were saying that they wanted to use in order to make it more appealing to the masses, right?
Yeah, that sanitization. We saw it with, you mentioned David Duke. We saw it with David Duke in the 1980s, right? When he said, throw off your white capes and put on your business suits. And that's the same sort of thing. That's sort of the alt-right in particular, and their mastery of that mainstreaming of hate, that sanitization, making both their appearance and their narratives more palatable.
Thank you, Ms. Dama. Madame LaRouche, 1 minute, 5, s'il vous plaît.
1.5 minutes, please.
Oui. Is
it my turn, Mr. Chair? Oh, sorry about that. Now, Mr. Le Président and Ms. Perry, first you, perhaps Ms. Perry, you raised the issue of the culture of bearing firearms in the context of radicalization of paramilitary and far-right groups. You can both answer this question, but there's a link between radicalization and the bearing of arms, number one, I guess, and secondly, what solution do you think exists, whether it be online or whatever, to avoid this kind of arms culture which radicalizes certain groups?
So 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, I'll speak to the first half, and perhaps Dr. Leprecht, you can respond to the second half. And that is, Dr. Leprecht mentioned this notion of, defending our way of life, and this is why there's this desire to take up arms to defend our way of life as they understand it, which is very different than I think Dr. Leprecht was speaking about there. For us, the idea is to defend equity, inclusion, respect for diversity. For them, those are exactly the threats. So that defensiveness really is the foundation of that arms narrative that we're seeing. And I'll allow you to answer what do we do?
Well, he's not going to be allowed to answer it only because we're running behind time. I apologize. Mr. Harris, 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And Ms. Perry, at the end of your commentary, you talked about anti-Semitism as not quite an afterthought, but that it wasn't part of the mainstream of your concerns. But we met with members of the Jewish community who are very concerned about the rise in anti-Semitism over the past number of years, 4 or 5 at least, and that they are concerned about their security and safety, and with direct attacks and ongoing threats against them. Is that something that you've noticed, or is that something that's separate from this far-right extremism? And what can be done about that?
Sorry, as I indicated, it's sort of the foundation of so much else that's associated with the far right, but you're absolutely right. I mean, every indicator has suggested quite a dramatic increase over the last 5 years or so, from the benign birth reports to the official data that we have, and certainly in the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks, with heightened tensions, activity, I should say, in the Middle East, we've seen a really dramatic uptick in online attacks as well as physical attacks on Jewish communities across the country. So that is absolutely a significant issue. Even the COVID-related narratives are not just anti-Asian, but also anti-Semitic. Those very traditional, age-old conspiracy theories rear their head again.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Mr. Van Popta, 3 minutes, and then Mr. Fisher will finish the round at 3 minutes. Mr. Van Popta.
Good, thank you very much. So 3 minutes is not a lot of time to talk about such important issues, but question to Dr. Luprecht. So thank you for your testimony. You had talked about the pyramid, and maybe you could expand on that a little bit, but what I've scribbled down is that at the bottom are activists who are maybe engaged in objectionable behavior, and then radicals who are engaged in illegal behavior, and then terrorists. And in an earlier response to Mr. Kirk's question, you had said that bravado is not a good predictor. So what is a good predictor of somebody moving from one level to the other in this pyramid?
And that is the million-dollar question. And I think we can show that this is very poorly established. The RCMP, when they testified 2 weeks ago, mentioned 273 cases in 2019 and 2020. How many of those did actually result in actionable charges? The Victoria Parliament plot there. So I would say that, yes, this is a security intelligence problem, but it turns out that on the criminal intelligence side, we're not doing that great, perhaps, a job. Or we can also infer that it's actually not as big a problem as the resources that we're actually devoting to this particular issue. And it is easy for us to capture because we can see it and we have a visceral reaction. Most human beings who live in democracy have a visceral reaction against it, but that it remains a phenomenon very much at the margins. And I think we need to remember here, to circle back to the issue about the United States, the US is a very polarized society and has always been, and its own political institutions reinforce that. And I think we have political institutions that have always sort of forced more of the views into a more moderate and reconciliatory institutional process. And so, yes, there will always be some spillover in views from the United States, but that by and large, our society has done a better job at moderating those and is helping to reconcile those within our political mainstream.
30 seconds.
You're not going to be able to answer this in 30 seconds, but you had said that perhaps empowering CSIS would be a good tool for Canadian public safety. If you could expand on that for a few seconds.
I think in general, we have a relatively homeopathic approach in this country towards all matters of national security. And if we improved the overall capabilities, capacities, and skill sets of our national security agencies, both criminal intelligence and security intelligence, that would have ancillary benefits for the whole spectrum of public security threats, including ideologically motivated violent extremism. And this is, of course, critical in a highly diverse society where we cannot have people try to antagonize one another by virtue of differing views, opinions, or backgrounds.
Thank you, Mr. Van Popta. Mr. Fisher, final 3 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Dr. Perry, so it's fair to say that some individuals are more susceptible to being radicalized. I think you touched on that. You used hypermasculinity as an example. And then with MP Demoff, you talked about the grievances, that the things that inspire right-wing extremist groups, to do the things that they do. I'm interested in the fact that these groups tend to hijack a movement, whether it's a yellow vest or whether it's an anti-masker or an anti-vasker. They don't necessarily have their own, or they're looking for bigger numbers by joining and hijacking a movement. Unfortunately, we only have a couple of minutes, but I thought maybe you could just touch on some of that phenomenon.
Yeah, it's exactly as you describe it. They do have their own, I wouldn't say coherent ideologies, but often, a foundation anyway. And in an attempt to make it more appealing to a broader audience, they will sort of glom onto, if you will, those very typical, normal, banal, everyday kinds of grievances or anxieties, whether they're economic or cultural, or even physical in terms of threat of crime, or in this case, in the context of COVID, threat of disease. So they will exploit those narratives and explain them through often the lens of race, or the lens of immigration, or the lens of gender, even. So I think that's where the danger is of bringing unsuspecting people, unintentional people into the movement.
So that's very much like the anti-Asian hate that we would see rising in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, explaining a medical problem, or a social problem through the lens of race.
You talked about the impact of COVID on all of us. We're talking about meeting virtually rather than meeting in person. Tell me the impact that might have had on some of these right-wing groups. I think I read somewhere that because of COVID, some groups have been decommissioned, but I wonder whether they're just harder to see.
I think they're actually more visible online. I mean, that's what we're seeing, that there's more activity online, less activity offline, because believe it or not, they're actually obeying the stay-at-home orders as well, for the most part. But they're very active online and very visible. Some of them easier to see than others. Even Proud Boys, right, who were designated, they actually rebranded in Hamilton, for example, as Canada First. So I think this is what will happen as we push them underground. They'll pop up in another form. The base and Atomwaffen were also designated. I don't think they're going to go anywhere because those are the most extreme. They're the worst of the worst. So they've just dug in their heels rather than disbanded. But they're out there. I wouldn't advise going looking for them, but if you go looking for them, they're easily found.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher and colleagues. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of this hour. I'm sure, like I would dearly love this hour to continue, and I dearly love to ask a few more questions, but time is the enemy here. So on behalf of the committee, I want to thank Dr. Perry and Dr. Luprecht for a very thoughtful and informed and very able analysis. And it would be delightful to call you back, and I just don't know when we might have that opportunity. So again, thank you very much. We'll suspend while Drs. Perry and Liebert leave, and Mr. Gursky and Mr. Geoffroy get into the room. So thank you. We're suspended for a minute or two. Dr. Gursky, retired Canadian intelligence analyst, and then go to Martin Gaufroy, Director and Research Professor. So with that, Mr. Gursky, you have 7 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, for inviting me today. As you said, on rather short notice, I found out about this little before noon today, but I'm absolutely humbled to be asked to appear today. I had the opportunity to listen to the previous witnesses give their testimony, and I want to make a few points, preliminary remarks, and then a few substantive remarks before my 7 minutes are up. I did spend 32 years in working in security intelligence in Canada, both for Communications Security Establishment, or CSE, as well as for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS. And so the remarks that I'm going to share with you today are based on that experience. I am not an academic, despite the fact I have written 6 books on terrorism since my so-called retirement from CSIS in 2015. And so my experience with looking at violent extremism, looking at radicalization, looking at terrorism stems from actually working on investigations, several hundred of which I did when I worked at CSIS as a strategic analyst. But having said that, I have been retired for 6 years, which means I have not had daily access to intelligence for more than half a decade. So I would ask the members of this committee to bear in mind that I don't think my knowledge is that out of date. I don't think a lot has changed since 2015, but that it's important to realize that the remarks I'm going to give to you today are based in part on my historical experiences with dealing on counterterrorism investigations in Canada and abroad, and that they do date those from they're 6 years in terms of their age. I was a little bit surprised, in all honesty, listening to the previous witnesses, both of whom I know very, very well and have a great deal of respect for, that in 2021, we're no longer talking about the elephant in the room, which is Islamist extremism. If you read the headlines anywhere in the world on a daily basis, and I'm not just talking about Afghanistan and Somalia and Nigeria and Sahel, but Western Europe, other parts, United States, etc., not a day goes by without either an attack or an arrest when it comes to Islamist terrorism. And if you look at the Global Terrorism Index, which is the single best resource in the world, they issue an annual report on terrorism. 99.4% of all terrorist attacks in the world on a yearly basis are carried out by what we call Islamist extremists. Now, you notice I use the term Islamist extremism. I'm not a big fan of this newfangled IMVE, ideologically motivated violent extremism. I think it sacrifices accuracy on the altar of, I'm not sure what on the altar of what. But to me, you can't deal with a problem unless you name it accurately. And this is why we talk about far-right extremism. This is why we talk about far-left extremism. This is why we talk about Islamist extremism or Hindu extremism in India, or even Buddhist extremism, which should be an oxymoron. There are Buddhist terrorists actually in the world, okay? So I just want to push back a little bit. That terminology was not active when I worked at CSIS. It came in after my retirement. I'm not going to draw any conclusions based on that, but I do recommend that we call things what they are and be as accurate as possible. The other issue that I don't disagree with Professor Leuprecht for RMC, again, I've known Christian for a very long time. When he talks about this being a small problem, he's absolutely correct to a certain extent. It's true that Canada has not faced a great deal of terrorism in the entirety of our 154 years as a country. In fact, I just published a book on a history of terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the present, and the attacks have been few and far between. But at the same time, the reason why there have been so few attacks is because CSIS and the RCMP have successfully thwarted some very important plots. Now, you may have recalled the past weekend, there's an article in global media as well as the National Post about an individual called Zacharias Amara, who was up for parole. He was a member of the Toronto 18, a case that I followed from the very first day until their arrest in June of 2006. Nothing happened because of the RCMP and CSIS. Had that group been successful in carrying out their attack probably in August of 2006, they would have killed hundreds and wounded thousands of people. But we stopped them. So I think when we talk about numbers, we should celebrate the fact that as a nation, we do not suffer from successful terrorist attacks on a regular basis. which is true. We don't have simply the critical numbers that other countries have. But let's not lose sight of the fact that a lot of plots were foiled. You know, when you work in security intelligence, you realize nobody cares when you get it right. Nobody cares when you stop an attack. They only care when you don't stop the attack, and that's where fingers are pointed. Why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you recruit sources? So I don't disagree with the previous witnesses that when it comes to terrorism as a national priority, we don't have the criticality that many of our partners have. To give you one statistic, which should illustrate this, I think, very profoundly. The CSIS equivalent in the United Kingdom is called MI5, the British Security Service. And in recent years, they have stated publicly that they have 23,000 people of interest and 30 concurrent threat to life plots that they're worried about. Let those numbers sink in for a second. 23,000 people capable of carrying out active terrorism and 30 actual plots. In my time at CSIS, we had a couple hundred investigations at any given time. So the numbers, simply don't match what our allies have. But more importantly, one of the previous guests talked about talk versus action. And it's true. There are many more talkers than there are walkers. Many people talk the talk and don't walk the walk. You don't know who's going to walk the walk until you investigate them. And yes, there are no reliable predictors in this regard, but that's why you do investigations. That's why you look into people to determine, is this person serious, or is this person merely spouting things online or offline to sound important, to raise a grievance, to share their anger with people? That's why we have CSIS. This is why we have the RCMP. Not surprisingly, I'm a big supporter of CSIS. I worked there for 15 years. I'm a big supporter of the RCMP. I do think these organizations do a fine job on our behalf. And I think the bottom line is they have to be adequately resourced. Even if the problem is not as large as it is in many countries around the world, doesn't mean the problem's gone away. Dr. Perry talked about the far right. I don't have a lot to say about the far right. It wasn't my specialty. But there is a variety of types of violent extremism, terrorist movements out there, some domestic, some international, that still pose a threat to Canadian national security.
Okay, we're going to have to, unfortunately, going to have to leave it there.
Resources necessary to deal with it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Madame LaRouche, yes, I see your hand.
Oui, alors
yes, Mr. Gursky, on a number of occasions, the interpreters had trouble understanding you. I don't know if something can be fixed or improved with your headset, but on a couple of occasions, the interpreters had trouble understanding you.
Okay, maybe if the interpreters could indicate in the future, as Mr. Gursky responds to questions, whether there's any issues, it may be something to do with your microphone or your inflection or something of that nature.
Okay.
So
Thank
if
you,
we could just keep that in mind, and then we can respond. Professor Jeffrey, you're on mute.
Oui, Professor Geoffroy.
Yes, my name is Professor Geoffroy. I'm sorry about that pronunciation. Is it my turn? Yes? 7 minutes. Thank you. Well, listen, I think that my colleague Barbara Perry, who's interested in the far right as I am, has conducted research which deals especially with the appearance of the far right online. Now, recently, my Centre for Research, which is located in Longueuil, close to Montreal, released research on the far right in Quebec, but not online. There's a lot of research on online far right activities, and very rarely is there any research on events that are linked to the far right in the streets of cities and towns. And I was fascinated when I started my research that in terms of scientific research, particularly on Quebec, there's almost never, prior to the research that we have done at our centre, any attempt at trying to determine how many incidents occurred in Quebec that were linked to the far right. So that's what we did. And as part of that research, we set out a timeline of far-right activities in Quebec over the past decade from 2010 to 2020. And as I said, the lion's share of the research that has been done to date has been on online appearances. Now, my colleague, Professor Gersti, talked earlier about walking the talk or etc. But it's one thing to say online that in fact use hate speech, but then a different kettle of fish to do so out in the field in the general public. And to many people's great surprise, in Quebec, we've had 521 incidents linked to the far right over the past 10 years. Now, I'll be able to delve into that in the Q&A. We conducted a very broad, far-reaching, longitudinal study, and we sent you a number of documents highlighting the most active groups. Now, what we noted is that there was an increase in 2017. I don't know if you recall the events of the Quebec City Mosque and also those to do with the Quebec Values Charter. There was a rise of the far right. In 2009, there was a slight drop, if you look at the curve, and then there was an uptick in 2020, the year of the pandemic, of course, when it came to this nebulous far right in Quebec that in a way took advantage of the pandemic. Now, in addition to the far right, we've studied the GAMs, which are the conspiracy theory groups, and also the anti-public health measures groups. And what we've noticed in our research is that most of these far right groups in 2020 sort of morphed into anti-public health measure groups. And we call them in French GAMs, which are anti-public health measure groups, which are comprised primarily of former members of a multitude of far-right groups that no longer exist, Storm Alliance, La Meurtre, etc., that have almost disappeared from existence. So those that in 2009 were part of those groups have morphed and joined these anti-public health measure groups. So our research has demonstrated that in terms of incidents, there's been a rise in far-right incidents, not necessarily online, but out in the field, in real life. For example, protests, hateful graffiti, online harassment, demonstrations. These are real concrete actions out in the field, not just spewing or spouting hate speech online. And this has even, we've seen terrorist acts, we've seen the harassment of opponents or adversaries, we've seen bullying. In 2018, at a conference or a lecture that I gave in a cégep as part of a concrete conference on the far right, the group La Meurtre came and bullied us and intimidated us and booed us. We spent an entire day in their company. So these are bullying tactics that have also been listed and categorized in our 521 events that took place, observed between 2010 and 2020. So we've seen an increase in Quebec in the number of real-life protests to do with the far right, and also a rise in violence. In 2020, we've seen the greatest number of violent events. Now, I was surprised to hear Barbara Perry earlier say that those who are part of far-right movements were obeyed public health measures. Perhaps Quebec is a distinct society in that respect. I don't know. But what I would say is that far-right movements in Quebec are very, very much anti-public health measure groups. And they're, in fact, ringleaders and have spearheaded that movement. And they systematically flouted public health measures. Is that my 7 minutes up, Mr. Chairman?
Une minute, s'il vous plaît.
Oh, we have 1 minute left, I see.
Alors, si on regarde un peu...
So if we just provide an overview of the highlights here, we have 113 events involving violence across categories. There's we can see the breakdown of violence. There's been 21% to do with the far right. And we can see a rise in the trend of violence since 2010, with a particular uptick in the second half of the decade. An annual rate has increased, and it's gone from an average of 2.9 events in 2010 to 2020. So there's been a rise in violence to do with the far right in Quebec, and that is a real problem. Physical violence has also seen an uptick in the second half of the decade. On average, there's been 2 events, including physical violence, per year before 2015, and then 9 events or incidents involving physical violence from 2016 onwards. And there's particular violent spikes in 2017, 23 incidents, and then 25 in the following year. So 2020 was the most violent year of the whole decade.
Thank you. Merci, Monsieur Professor Geoffroy. This is the 6-minute round. Mr. Van Popta, Mr. Lightbound, Madame LaRouche, and Mr. Harris. 6 minutes each, please. Mr. Van Popta.
Thank you very much to the witnesses for being here. My first question will be to Professor Geoffroy. You talked quite a bit about the extreme right. Now, the CSIS says that that's not a very useful categorization, and they adopted the term ideologically motivated violent extremism, IMVE. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, but also specifically whether you, they've identified 3 categories: ideologically, politically, and religiously motivated extreme violence. How useful do you think those 3 categorizations are? Particularly, like the mosque attack in Quebec was categorized as ideologically motivated, not religiously motivated.
Okay. Well, what do I think about this? Well, for my part, I think that when you talk about Islamism and you relate, je pense que je vais parler en français. It's easier.
I think after all, I'll speak in French. So I think that as far as Islamic terrorism is concerned and the far right, and let's not mention Christianity, this has a cultural element to it. Now, when we refer to Islamic terrorism, we talk about religion, but when we talk about terrorism of another religion other than ours, that is the Christian faith, we end up dissociating the political far right and making the distinction between it and the Christian faith. And yet all far-right groups are all Christian fundamentalists at core. And you have to make a distinction between what we call mainstream religion, those that go to church on a Sunday and go to Mass, and religious fundamentalism that is found across all monotheistic religions across the world. Islamism, Buddhism, as my colleague even said earlier, in Burma, there are terrorists there too, let me assure you. So these categories, to my mind, aren't really very effective because to some extent, when we talk about Christianity, for example, they don't take into account the fact that there is fundamentalism, whether it be Catholic fundamentalism or other Christian fundamentalism, that is very close, very intimately tied with far-right extremism. Just let me give you an example in Quebec. The neo-fascist, one of the most active neo-fascist groups in Quebec is called Atalante, and there's also the old stock Quebecers group, les Québécois de souche, and their closely tied with a Catholic group that own a fundamentalist Catholic school in the town of Lévis, and that group is a source of inspiration, and I can refer you to an article on this. But we've seen that across all of these groups in Quebec, the intellectual source of inspiration that they draw on, and politically speaking, is a religious group called La Fraternité. There's even a group in Longueuil, and there'll be another article published in September dealing with this. And they are also basing their far-right ideology on that fraternity. And there's new youth far-right groups that are popping up that are being highlighted in the article that we're going to be publishing in September. These are the Zoomers and the Groypers. I'm not going to go into the definition of what they are today, but it's very closely tied to the whole culture of mimes and so on. And there was one of my students, for example, or one of the students in that group that comes from the cégep where I teach. Now, I would never have believed that in the course of my career, I would have come across traditional Catholic fundamentalist far-right extremists, but they do exist. They are out there. Fortunately, they are fringe groups. They're quite they're marginal. But the fact that they're fringe groups doesn't mean that they're not dangerous. But in direct response to your question, there's I think when you draw up a list of categories, you need to factor in whether it be for the far right or the far left. All of those groups are, in fact, tightly bound with monotheistic fundamentalist religious groups. But in Quebec, they're very, very, very closely tied with fundamentalist groups, not necessarily the Catholic religion, but, for example, the fraternity that I referred to is not a group that's part of the Catholic Church. They were excommunicated from the Catholic Church in 1988. So they're definitely a fringe group, a sectarian fringe group. And I think that
Mr. Van Popper's time is up.
Okay. Sorry.
I apologize for that. Time is the enemy in all of these committee meetings. Mr. Lightbound, 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. Mes questions vont s'adresser.
The interpreter will suspend service momentarily. Mr. Lightbound's microphone is not properly connected.
Oh, Joel, your microphone is not connected properly.
Is
that better now, interpreters? Hello?
Could he speak for a moment, please? Yes. The problem seems to be fixed. Yes, my apologies to the interpreters, says Mr. Lightbound. My headset was not properly connected. The problem's now fixed. Thank you, Mr. Geoffroy, for your attendance, and thank you for your report, which confirms the importance of the study that we are undertaking. Now, following the testimony that we've heard, I feel compelled to say that if you look at the increase in far-right incidents, you've said that there's been a huge rise from 2010 to 2020. This is a huge increase, especially if you look at the most recent CSIS report on threats in Canada, and it indicates that ideological IVMVE has led to over 20 deaths in Canada, and we're not just talking about political, but also religious and ideologically motivated. Now, in the remarks from Barbara Perry earlier, we heard that far-right movements are closely tied with pro-weapons groups. For example, the Proud Boys who tout the fact that they love their guns. Now, do we see that kind of alignment in the far right in Quebec, and is that borne out in your research?
Vous êtes en sourdine, Monsieur.
You're on mute, Mr. Geoffroy.
Je pense qu'à chaque fois, ça me...
Well, I think that I'm put back automatically on mute each time. My apologies. Well, listen, we didn't focus in on those particular groups. However, there are groups in Quebec that place a lot of value on weapons and arms. I think that there are more, Proud Boys are more current or more present in English Canada than in Quebec. But when it comes to the far right, there's a whole culture of affirming one's virility, one's masculinity, and also freedom of expression, but also the freedom to bear arms, which comes a bit from the United States now, doesn't it? Now, bearing arms or taking up arms is closely tied to what we would qualify or categorize as traditional or conventional masculinity. The role of women in far right groups, and there are studies that we've conducted on this, we've interviewed a number of women who are members of far right groups, and women's roles in those groups is highly conventional. For example, they cook. They don't make the decisions. They're not the decision makers in those groups. But it's interesting that those groups are dominated by women over and above men. But in direct response to your question, very quickly, there are indeed close ties between the value that is placed on bearing arms and extremism. Now, in Quebec, there are far-right groups that'll get dressed up as soldiers in the street, and we've noticed in our studies, because we're studying this and we're going to have a conference on it, we're working with the Military College of Saint-Jean on this project, and there will be a conference on the far right in the army next in the fall in my cégep, for example, and we've noticed that there are a lot of former military servicemen in these extreme far right groups, and that they place a lot of importance on bearing arms. And one of the biggest far-right groups in Quebec traditionally is led by a former soldier of the Canadian Armed Forces who was a fighter in the Afghanistan war. He founded the group because he said he was traumatized by the war in Afghanistan. And La Meurtre, that group is a fascinating one in the sense that they have a military power structure. And for example, in the group La Meurtre, they use military rankings to define their hierarchy. So there is definitely a link in that way. I'm sorry to cut you off because I'm running out of time, but it's highly interesting. But in your report, you showed over the past decade the progression of these groups: germination, outbreak, growth and development, mutation and spread. And in 29 and 10, we saw groups like La Meurtre in the streets, and they fed off what occurred in current events, for example, the US election, refugees claiming asylum at the border, also the secularism chart and the Quebec Values Charter, and also the immigration deal, the International Immigration Pact on refugees. A whole lot of conspiracy theories such that Canada was, in fact, ceding or giving up its borders, and that, for example, those kinds of theories. And you've said that since 2020, there has been more of a nativist mutation based on a fear of immigration, xenophobia, racism, and also anti-power, anti-elite, and anti-public health measure groups. To what extent do we see an overlapping in these far-right groups? Are they in stovepipes, or is there an overlapping between xenophobia, etc., etc.? Well,
please.
I have 20 seconds. Yes, indeed, you have 20 seconds. So I don't know how to answer in 20 seconds, but basically what we've observed is that in the past year, far-right groups have set aside their anti-immigration discourse to an extent and focused more heavily on anti-authority discourse. And by that I mean anti-authority in all its stripes and colours. And perhaps someone else might like to ask me another question about this and I can delve into that issue. But behind that anti-authority discourse, the anti-immigration discourse is never far behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lightbound. I'm sure Madame LaRouche would be delighted to have that question carried on, but 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
6 minutes, Madame LaRouche. Well, thank you very much, sir. You know me very well. I would indeed like to tack on to what my colleague Mr. Lightbound just said. It's fascinating, but very quickly, because I do have other questions for you, Mr. Geoffroy. You did raise the issue of a study that will be soon released on far-right groups in the Canadian Armed Forces, and you said there'll be a conference at your Quebec. So we're talking about toxic masculinity, misogyny that we see as a backdrop. But in the immigration policy discourse, there's this conventional role of the woman that is subsumed, and they have to, of course, make more children. It's an nativist discourse, isn't it? So this is an interesting phenomenon. What's the question in all of that, please, Ms. Larouche? Well, my question, you referred to the study that you're conducting on the far right in the Canadian Armed Forces and of toxic masculinity and the sexualization of women, for example. You referred to that. Well, listen, I didn't study women in the Canadian Armed Forces. Our study was with the Saint-Jean Military College, which is close to our location here. And that student officers' points of view on various religions and their susceptibility to radicalization. And that's what we're going to be presenting at that symposium. There's already been studies on the far-right movement within the army that will be presented in February at that conference. So I don't have any outcomes or results to present right now to you, per se, but what I can tell you right now is that, well, I can't speak to the army. We haven't got the results. But among far-right groups, I've conducted a lot of interviews of senior-ranking women in far-right groups in Quebec, and they all have said the same thing, that women play a very traditional role within those groups. The women are basically there in the service of men. There are exceptions to the rule. For example, groups like the Soldier of Rodin, who had a woman at its head, so that bucked the trend, but often they become leaders of those groups after their boyfriends go to prison or something else happens to them and they take over. So it's almost like a family handing over of power between family members. The women join those groups as the girlfriend of Mr. So-and-so. Usually the women's role is very traditional within those groups. Well, thank you very much. Just to tack on to the previous question, we know that IMVE is a very serious problem we need to take seriously, and there's been a huge rise in IMV over the past decade. For example, neo-Nazi, misogynist, incel, hate. There are communications cells that are being used by those hate groups. And in the report, you say that job losses caused by the pandemic have further increased the likelihood of these people to end up in echo chambers and to become radicalized. So how can you prevent that kind of radicalization? Obviously, there is a link between online presence, which also saw an uptick during the pandemic response. Well, yes, it does have to do with the online presence, but it goes deeper than that. The whole conspiracy theory issue that we're observing increasingly, and these far-right groups have cognitive biases. This is a crucial notion. And whether they're far-right or far-left extremists, they're what a French colleague that I work to, Gérald Bonheur, calls the market of ideas, the cognitive market of ideas that's available in an online setting. And we have no control over that market of ideas. And the proposals that are the most attractive aren't necessarily the true ones based on science. They are more to do with conspiracy theories. And often behind those conspiracy theories, we see the core of racism, which is at the root cause. We've spoken a lot about QAnon, for example. But QAnon is basically an old conspiracy theory which has been recycled, dusted off, and modernized. But it's the same old conspiracy theory. Now, when it comes to, for example, pedophile cabals, well, there was a group in the White Berets in the Catholic Church, and those White Berets were already referring to a sadomasochist pedophile cabals, and that the government was going to inject microchips under our skin to control us. So that's the same thing that's being recycled. QAnon is nothing new. It makes me laugh a bit when I hear that, because we're talking about conspiracy theories that keep on bubbling up and again and again. And the whole goal is to find a scapegoat for our misfortunes. And God knows over the past year, a lot of people across the world have faced a lot of misfortune. So there's a deep need to find a scapegoat, whether it be the Chinese virus, that.
Thank you. I apologize again, but we're actually in rough shape here. Mr. Harris, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to you both for the very interesting presentations. First of all, Dr. Jaffar, you talked about these groups changing or morphing over the years to become lately all focused on or acting up on the anti-vaccination, anti-public health thing. So does that mean that they're not really tied to any particular ideology, that they're sort of perhaps attitudes, looking for a place to act up, or looking for a home, or looking for a cause to align to so they can carry out their attitudinal behavior? Is that something that's going on as well?
Que ce soit dans nos recherches ou dans les...
Well, whether it be our research or the UNESCO Sherbrooke University research, well, we're both conducting research on the various anti-health measure groups. There is a core to that discourse, which definitely has a far-right flavour to it. But what we've observed is that these anti-public health measure groups during the pandemic, well, we've seen a crystallization of other movements that have morphed and formed one kind of group based around that idea of anti-public health measures. And my colleague has already published articles on this. These are anti-authority movements that often base their ideas on conspiracy theories. They call into question all government authority, all the authority of teachers or professors, because we're considered indoctrinators and brainwashers in their hymn book. So what we've noticed in...
I interrupted, just trying to keep the question going, but are they migrating from other existing groups like the Adelante or various ones that you mentioned?
Well, yes, indeed, there is a level of migration from one group to another. One of the anti-public health measure group leaders, Mr. Anti Charlin, was the former number 2 from La Meurthe, and Mario Roy is an individual who's now behind bars, and he was part of the Mouvement des Citoyens Souverains, and he is in prison for contempt of court, and he was a former member of La Meurthe and the Storm Alliance. So there was a dropping off of those groups in 2019, and they've migrated to anti-public health measure groups, and they've even taken the helm of those groups and become the leaders of those groups. And we've seen that kind of crystallization. Now, among anti-vaccine groups, there are a lot of folks that believe in the New Age and who think that we can heal cancer by the power of positive thinking, for example. Now, up until prior to the pandemic, these groups barely merited our attention and we didn't really consider them very dangerous. But with the onset of the pandemic and the anti-vax movement, well, it became dangerous, didn't it? It's one thing to refuse vaccination, but in the context of a pandemic, that might lead to people's death. So these groups didn't get much scrutiny before the pandemic, but they crystallized and morphed and sort of coalesced around the same ideas. And so we've got anti-vaccine discourse mixed and with the far-right ideas. Now, what's going to happen post-pandemic? Will these groups become fragmented again, or will they continue to coalesce around some ideas? I don't have a crystal ball.
The idea of these individual groups being, a danger to society. When I look at your research, the end result is about 20% over 10 years of what involvement in some kind of violence, which would be either verbal, physical, or online. How serious is the danger that they pose? They have threats and hate speech listed as your categories of violence: vandalism, mischief, physical conflict, harassment and bullying, attacks and assaults 6%, terrorism 1%. How are they serious threat and danger to life and the limb, or are they at a lower level than that, for the most part?
La caractéristique, en fait, c'est que...
Well, what characterizes them? Well, often people say, well, they're not dangerous because there aren't many members to those groups. They're fringe groups. And often we assess the far right in Canada to be fewer than 1% of the Canadian population that are members of far right groups. Now, when there are political parties that have far-right ideologies, they don't really garner many votes. They usually poll at under 1%, and they don't get members of parliament elected either, do they? So these are extreme fringe groups. But when it comes to level of dangerousness, just because they're fringe groups doesn't mean that they're not dangerous. Now, we saw this with the mosque terrorist attack. All you need is one single individual that is fed off extremist ideology, and you end up with a terrorist attack. So these groups are dangerous to the extent that all you need is just a couple of individuals. And when an individual becomes dangerous, when they get desperate, when they realize that their political option is very unlikely to see anyone elected, and then they start to...
I'm going to have to leave it there. Apologize again, which I do quite frequently. Colleagues, once again, we have 25 minutes worth of questioning in the second round, and we have 17 minutes in which to accomplish it. So I'm going to be arbitrary again and cut members back to about half of what they were going to anticipating. With that, we'll start with Mr. Kirk, 12 minutes, Madame Lampropoulos, 12 minutes, 1.5 for Harris, LaRouche, Stubbs, and Damoff, 3 minutes each. So, Mr. Kirk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, I'd like to thank both the witnesses for coming today. Mr. Gursky, what would your opinion, your expert opinion, be on the threshold for determining if something rises to being terrorism? Because it appears that there's a great deal of overlap between what could be religious extremism and motivated attacks, for example, against the Jewish community. But those could also be xenophobic IMVE by this study's definition. Similarly, anarchy is a political system defined by the absence of a government. So how do you differentiate from political extremism when it comes to anti-authority violence? And is there any differentiation between these groups?
And can you hold your microphone up close to your mouth, please? Thank you. Oh. It's also better to go off mute. Excellent.
That would probably help.
Yes.
Yeah. Mr. Kirk, it's an excellent question, and I'm glad you asked it. And as somebody who worked in counterterrorism for as long as I did, I asked myself that a lot of times too. You know, we at CSIS were driven by the criminal code. And in section 83.01 of the criminal code, it defines an act of terrorism. It's a serious act of violence, planned or perpetrated for three primary reasons: ideological, political, or religious. That's right out of the criminal code. A lot of what I'm hearing described today, in my mind, would not qualify an act of terrorism. It could qualify as a hate crime, such as misogyny. It could qualify as a run-of-the-mill crime, if I can use that term. An example, I hear a lot of references to the incel attack in Toronto in 2018. And I went on record in Canadian media saying that's not an act of terrorism. That was an act of violent misogyny. So I do think when we mash these terms together, it's very problematic. It's very problematic from the perspective of who gets to look at them. So CSIS doesn't do criminal investigations. It's a security intelligence service that gathers intelligence to help the RCMP and law enforcement at the end of the day. I think we have to be very careful with terminology here. And a lot of what Mr. Geoffroy is talking about, to me, is absolutely worrisome. But it sure as heck isn't terrorism. It's something else that's on our plate of ills, if you want, as a Canadian society. I prefer to limit the term very, very closely. And I've even advocated just getting rid of the term terrorism altogether out of the criminal code, because there are other crimes, other prosecutions that are possible to take care of these things.
You have about 20 seconds.
So it's tough to ask a question on that, but if you could define violent extremism, what would that definition be?
Most people will see violent extremism and terrorism as synonymous. I tend to lean in that direction, and I be perfectly honest, Mr. Couric, I don't have the time to split hairs on whether there's a difference between the two. To me, they're virtually synonymous.
Thank you, Mr. Couric. Madame Labropoulos, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank both of our witnesses for being here with us to answer our questions. Very, very interesting testimony on both parts. Monsieur Geoffroy, ma première question est pour vous.
Mr. Geoffroy, my first question is for you. In your report, you referred to 521 events. Did that include online events? I don't recall if you referred to those. You're on mute, sir. Sorry about that. No, it doesn't include online incidents, only those that have occurred in real life. The only online events that we've included are specifically those to do with harassment. Well, here's my second question then. Did you determine what the reason for this increase over the past decade is? I'm not referring to 2020, because you said by far that was the year with the most cases, and it was a special year, of course, because of COVID, and you referred specifically to Quebec in that context. But what I mean is, under normal circumstances, how would you explain that increase? Well, that'll be part and parcel of a study that we're releasing in September. There'll be a psychosocial interview that we've conducted that will be published. So I can't go into too much detail since it hasn't been released yet. But listen, the reasons are many and complicated. And let me refer to an interview that I did with the leader of the group La Meurtre. And I asked him why he came to bully us and intimidate us when we held a conference at the CEGEP. And he responded that it was the only way that we could have people listen to us. And there are a lot of organizations, not only in Quebec, but across the world, that get the sense that they're not being listened to.
Research during my master's, I actually I looked into misogyny and violence against women specifically, and one of the findings that I was able to find was that this number has actually gone up in big part because people have, obviously society has been evolving and more people are included. Women are actually getting places, they're holding positions of authority and of leadership, and people can't necessarily handle that. People, who have normally benefited from the status quo don't necessarily like that this is happening, and they feel like they need to speak out. What exactly are your thoughts on this?
20 seconds, please.
Vous avez absolument raison.
You're 100% right. You're spot on. I only have 20 seconds, so that's about the limit to what I can say.
Seconds now, but
I got 8 seconds. Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
Yes, you're right. That's part of the answer, but not the whole answer.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Lavopoulos. Madame LaRouche, minute and a half, please.
Oui, Monsieur Gursky, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Goetze, Mr. Geoffroy. Your testimony has been highly interesting. Just a very concise question. If I could hear from Mr. Geoffroy and then Mr. Gursky, you said that the only way to get heard, well, that getting heard is important to those groups. Now, I'd like to draw a parallel. I'd like to come back to what's occurring online. We know, according to the algorithms, that there are echo chambers, that there are vulnerable people who turn to far-right groups because they want to feel a sense of belonging and get heard. How can we change the rules of the game and algorithms on the internet without, in fact, limiting freedom of expression? That's an excellent question. Obviously, the answer isn't a straightforward one. I believe that we need to start by educating young people, and that's what I do. Biocognitive education. We have more and more difficulty understanding how, for example, humans react to a peer-reviewed study, for example. They consult the internet, and that's where they get their information, and they see that a certain Dr. Raoul has published X, Y, or Z. Now, his research on hydroxide was never peer-reviewed, and he just said, I'm a Nobel Prize-winning immunologist, and that's very popular among the far-right groups. Authority figures like that, they're on the one hand anti-authority, but on the other hand in favor of the authority that's in charge of them.
Thank you. I understand you also go online to rate your professor. Always a bit of fun. I wish I had gone to university when I could rate professors. With that, Mr. Harris, minute and a half.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question for Mr. Gursky. You said you heard the previous witnesses that Dr. Lubrecht talked about 12 mechanisms of radicalization, from personal grievance down to martyrdom. Excuse me. In your work with CSIS, identifying who it is you follow to see what happens to them, how do you pick from those, if it's so difficult, as Dr. Lebrecht pointed out, to actually predict who would end up in the other scores? Is there a method of selecting from this particular group? How do you actually do that?
That's a great question, Mr. Harris. I would simply say that we at CSIS had the legislative authority to investigate threats to national security based on what's called Section 2 of the CSIS Act. And you kind of just go with your gut in many ways. I will say that we came across many cases of people who appeared to just talk the talk and then would switch in a heartbeat to actually planning something, whether it's traveling abroad to join ISIS or things like that. It's not an exact science. And this is what worries me when we try to delineate this in such ways that it's only 12 mechanisms or it's only 12 of this. Life is unfortunately much more complicated than that. And I think a lot of us simply went either on our instinct or on the fact that we'd seen many previous investigations that were analogous to that. We didn't come up with any kind of a foolproof system. And I would submit to you, sir, that that is in fact a fool's errand to try to reduce this to something that is actually as simple as that. A lot of it is learning as you're going and having the necessary resources to take a look at those people when they actually started to do or plan to do some very, very dangerous things.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Madame Stubbs, 3 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, it seems evident from the diversity of perspectives of the many witnesses we've heard from already that this is extremely complex and that kind of monolithic applications or perspectives or approaches on these issues don't necessarily seem to be apt. And I guess sort of so leaping off of a question from Jack Harris, I wonder, Mr. Gursky, given your lived experience, work experience, and also the extensive writing you've done on the how versus the why of radicalization, just with the remaining time, I thought maybe you might want to expand on that for the committee.
Thank you, Ms. Stubbs. It really sounds simple, folks, but you go where the information leads you. And I think the problem is if you go in with preconceived notions, you start making errors. If you think that, for example, and I wrote about this a lot in my very first book, The Threat from Within, if you assume from the outset, for example, that poor socioeconomic status is a large contributor or predictor, you'll find out you're going to be wrong as many times as you're right. I think that the bottom line is that we entrust our law enforcement officers and security intelligence officers to gather the information and see where it's going to take them, and to try to make decisions based on what they're actually seeing, as opposed to some kind of a prearranged framework, if you will. But by saying this, I'm not poo-pooing the work done by academics such as Monsieur Geoffroy. I think it's very valuable. But those of us who worked in security intelligence, in all honesty, we didn't have the time to incorporate those theories because we're too busy doing investigations. Were they helpful? Yes, they were, but they didn't frame or dictate the directions in which we took our investigations. I'm not sure if that helps answer that question, but you're right. It is extremely complicated, and each case is different, unfortunately.
You have about a minute.
Oh, I have another minute. Go ahead. Sorry, Ms. Stubbs. Go ahead.
No. It's Ms. Stubbs' minute.
You could continue, or I did have a question for Dr. Geoffroy. Dr. Perry spoke about this a little bit, and there, of course, are reports that in Quebec, there are the highest rates of anti-Semitic incidents. The highest rates were in 2018 and 2019. And I know earlier you said that your words were the most violent year was in 2020. I wonder if you have any comments on that. What is the driver of that? Do you know why would this be the case localized in Quebec?
La particularité des groupes d'extrême.
Well, the particularity of far-right groups in Quebec is that they're bilingual and they fit in the nexus of far-right groups in North America and in France as well. And a lot of anti-Semitism comes from French far-right groups. That there's a long history of anti-Semitism, of course, in France. And the Fédération des Québécois des Souches, which is a old Quebec stock, and the beret blanc, the white berets, are in Rougemont-Niamey. They're anti-Semitic. They often talk about the global Jewish conspiracy, and that anti-Semitism is nothing new. We see it with QAnon, their obsession for George Soros, who's also a Jew. So there you go.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Madame Damoff, last 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to both our witnesses. Mr. Geoffroy, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. You mentioned earlier about the attack at the Quebec City Mosque. Alexandre, the shooter, I don't want to say his name, was a law-abiding gun owner prior to going in and killing six men and wounding 5 other ones. Recently in Quebec City, there was someone who was arrested with an arsenal in Mr. Lightbound's riding, an arsenal of weapons and bombs. There was a similar arrest in Alberta in end of April. What is the connection between far-right extremism? Obviously, at the Quebec City Mosque, we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism. We're also seeing a rise in Islamophobia, neither of which are acceptable in any way. But could you maybe talk about the connection between these terrorist acts and potential terrorist acts and far-right extremism?
Oui. Beaucoup de gens.
Yes. A lot of people believe that Alexandre Bissonnette did not commit a terrorist attack. I consider it a terrorist attack for the simple reason that Alexandre Bissonnette wasn't convicted or prosecuted for a terrorist act because he basically already was going to be put behind bars for life. And it's much tougher to prosecute someone for terrorism than for murder. So they set aside the terrorism charges because it would have been a waste of time. But had they pursued those charges, he could have been declared a terrorist. But the fact that had on the Muslim community of Quebec, for example, the fact that it wasn't declared a terrorist attack had a devastating effect. And the folks from the Quebec City Mosque considered it a terrorist attack, and they were very uncomfortable with the fact that it wasn't categorized as such and that he wasn't charged with terrorist acts. So it seems to give the impression that they're double standards. When it's a Muslim, well, it's always terrorism, isn't it? It's not about madness or people going crazy. And the whole conspiracy theories are often around the fact that, Alexandre Bissonnet did not draw his inspiration from the far right. Well, he was. He clearly. But if he was really mad, he would have been in a psychiatric unit and not behind bars. So this often has to do with cultural bias, I must point out. But if I could just conclude with the following. Ms. Larouche and Ms. Labouros, the research that we're conducting on women in far-right groups demonstrate that most of these women were victims of physical and sexual violence in their lives. And this is important data, and I'm giving you a bit of a scoop here right now today, but we'll see that data released later this year. These groups have attracted a certain type of woman, fragile women who will go and seek a sanctuary in those groups. Now, with Louis Brunet, a psychologist, I've been working on a narrative from one of the women who was part of one of those groups, and for her entire life she was a victim of abuse and domestic violence. So in these far-right groups that we're studying, clearly these are in fact fertile ground for sexual abuse. And for the past 20 years I've been studying sectarian groups, and it's very similar to the kind of abuse we see in sectarian groups, as part and parcel with a misogynist culture where women are basically...
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for that. Well, colleagues, that does bring our time to the end. On your behalf, I'd like to thank our last-minute witness, Mr. Gursky, for stepping in, and Professor Geoffroy for his obviously passionate and knowledgeable information on the field. And before I adjourn this meeting, I just note that after our meeting on Wednesday, where we have the minister and the commissioner, I'd like to add about 10 or 15 minutes so that we could get some idea of what we want to do with our views on the Bastarache report. So if you could sort of take a note that the next meeting will be a little bit longer than we would normally have. And if the other parties could give some indication to the chair and the clerk what they want to do with the supplement A, that would be helpful, bearing in mind that we have a very heavily negotiated and jam-packed agenda. So with that, again, thank you to both witnesses, and the meeting is adjourned.